At the will reading, my parents ordered, "Put your $26 million in the family accounts." I chose my grandparents' clause.
The heavy silence in the lawyer's opulent office was broken by my father's clearing his throat. A sound I knew meant he was about to issue a command, not make a request. Mr. Davies, my grandparents' longtime friend and attorney, had just finished reading the last line of the will, his kind eyes resting on me. $26 million. The number felt abstract, like a line in a novel, not something that now belonged to me, Amelia. My mother, Eleanor, sat beside my father, her posture perfect, her grief a carefully curated mask of tasteful sorrow. Well, that's settled then. My father, Richard, said, turning his crisp, commanding gaze from Mr. Davies to me. Amelia, we'll have our financial advisor contact you tomorrow to arrange the transfer of the funds into the family accounts. It's far too much for a young woman to manage on her own. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. My mother placed a cool, manicured hand on my arm, her rings digging slightly into my skin. "Your father is right, darling," she cooed, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "This is a family inheritance. We know how to best protect it, for all of us." They looked at me, expectant, waiting for the quiet, compliant nod they had received my entire life. They saw the same unassuming daughter they had always seen, the one who tried so hard to please them and never quite succeeded. They had no idea that the woman sitting before them had been fundamentally changed by the two people who had just left this world. They had no idea that my grandparents' final gift wasn't the money, but the meticulously crafted key to my own liberation, disguised as a last will and testament. I felt the weight of my grandmother's locket against my chest, a silent reminder of her strength, and for the first time in their presence, I said nothing at all, letting their arrogance fill the silent room. Their assumption was the first crack in the dam, and I knew a flood was coming. My childhood was a series of beautifully decorated empty rooms. My parents were masters of illusion, their lives a performance for an audience of social peers and business associates. Richard was a ruthless corporate climber, and Eleanor was the perfect corporate wife. They were a team, a well-oiled machine built for acquisition and advancement. I was their least successful merger, a line item they couldn't quite figure out how to leverage. My earliest memories are of silence, of the scent of my mother's expensive perfume lingering in the hallway long after she and my father had left for another gala, another fundraiser, another dinner party that was more about business than pleasure. I remember being 6 and the nanny forgetting to pick me up from school. I sat on the cold stone steps for 2 hours, watching other children run into the arms of their parents, until a janitor finally found me and called the emergency contact number. It wasn't my mother or my father. It was my grandfather. I remember the frantic look in his eyes when he arrived, wrapping me in his big, warm coat that smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He didn't say a word against my parents. He never did, but his grip on my small hand was all the condemnation they needed. My parents' parenting style was one of benign neglect, punctuated by sharp, surgical criticism. My grades were never quite high enough. My piano skills were passable, but not prodigious. My choice of friends was always slightly disappointing. "Amelia, darling, you must try harder to be interesting," my mother would say, adjusting a non-existent flaw in my dress. "No one is impressed by mediocrity." My father was more direct. "Stop being so sensitive, Amelia. The world doesn't reward sensitivity, it rewards strength. Toughen up." They weren't cruel in a way that left physical scars. Their damage was deeper, quieter. They had expertly chiseled away at my self-worth until I was convinced that I was inherently lacking, that their emotional distance was a natural reaction to my own inadequacies. I was a ghost in my own home, a quiet spectator to the lives of 2 glamorous strangers who happened to share my DNA. They gave me everything money could buy and nothing it couldn't. And all the while, I had no idea that this carefully constructed environment of emotional starvation was precisely what they would later count on to control me. Their greatest investment in me was my own insecurity. They expected it to pay dividends. The antidote to my parents' world of cold ambition was a 2-hour drive away, at a rambling house with a wraparound porch and a garden that was always in a state of chaotic bloom. My grandparents' home was my sanctuary. It was where I learned to breathe. My grandmother, Helen, taught me that my sensitivity wasn't a weakness but a superpower. She'd find me reading in a corner, and instead of telling me to be more social, she'd bring me a cup of tea and ask about the world I was visiting. The ability to live 1,000 lives through books, Amelia, is a gift. She'd say, her eyes twinkling, "It means you have a limitless heart." She taught me to bake, not from recipes, but from feel, showing me how to know when the dough was just right. How the smell of yeast and sugar was the smell of patience and love. My grandfather, Arthur, was a retired businessman, but he had none of my father's predatory sharpness. He was shrewd but kind, a man who had built his empire on handshakes and integrity. He saw my parents' ambition for what it was, a deep, gnawing hunger that could never be filled. He never criticized them to me, but he worked tirelessly to arm me against their influence. He's the one who taught me about money. He'd sit with me at his large oak desk, showing me stock market reports and explaining compound interest not as a tool for greed, but as a path to freedom. "Money is a tool, Millie, nothing more," he told me once, his large hand covering mine. "It can build things or it can break things. The only thing that matters is the character of the person wielding it." They were my true parents, the ones who attended my school plays, who remembered my favorite flavor of ice cream, who taught me how to ride a bike and how to stand up to a bully. They saw me, the real me, and they thought I was extraordinary. The summer I was 16, I overheard my parents arguing after a visit. "They're spoiling her, Richard," my mother had hissed. "Filling her head with nonsense. She's becoming soft." My father's reply was cold. "Let them. It keeps her out of our hair. And one day, their money will be our money. It's a long-term investment." That was the first time I understood. To my parents, even love was a transaction. My grandparents knew it too. And they spent the next decade of my life giving me the tools I would need to survive the fallout, culminating in one final, brilliant act of love and strategy from beyond the grave. The phone call came on a Tuesday. It was Mr. Davies. His voice, usually so full of gentle warmth, was thick with a grief that mirrored my own. They had gone together, peacefully, in their sleep, just as they had always wished. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from my lungs. My world, the safe, warm world they had built for me, had vanished. My parents, of course, swung into action. Their grief was a masterclass in public relations. My mother organized a funeral that was elegant, tasteful, and attended by everyone who mattered in their social circle. My father delivered a eulogy that was poignant and moving, full of borrowed sentiment about the patriarch of the family. They were performing, and they were brilliant. But in the quiet moments at home, the mask slipped. The conversations were not about the two wonderful people we had lost, but about the assets they had left behind. The house alone must be worth at least $3 million. My father mused over dinner, swirling his wine. And Arthur's investment portfolio, he was always cagey about it, but it has to be substantial. My mother nodded, her eyes distant. "I'll need to completely redo the interiors, of course. It's so dated, but the bones are good." They weren't ghouls, they simply saw the world through a different lens. To them, death was a transition of assets. People were temporary, but portfolios were forever. They spoke of our inheritance and the family money, never once acknowledging that it was their daughter who had been the center of my grandparents' world. They saw me as a conduit, a simple vessel through which the wealth would flow to its rightful owners. Them. Their assumptions were so complete, so ingrained, that they didn't even bother to hide them. A week after the funeral, my father sat me down in his study. "Amelia," he began, adopting his serious, man-of-the-world tone, "when Mr. Davies reads the will, I want you to be prepared. There will be a lot of legal jargon, but the essence is simple. Your grandparents' estate will pass to you, and then you will sign the necessary documents to place it under our management. It's the sensible thing to do." He smiled, a thin, patronizing smile. "We'll take care of everything. You won't have to worry your pretty little head about a thing." I just nodded, the way I always had. The quiet, sensitive, malleable daughter. It was the role I had played my entire life. It was the role they expected. And it was the role that was about to come to a spectacular, and for them, devastating, end. I was beginning to understand that my grandparents had left me more than a fortune. They had left me a battle plan. The week leading up to the will reading was like living in a waking dream. My parents were electric with anticipation, a poorly concealed giddiness buzzing just beneath their somber exteriors. They had already started spending the money in their minds, their conversations, a constant stream of blueprints and vacations, of cars and renovations. They moved through our silent house like conquering heroes who had finally come into their kingdom. One evening, my mother spread a dozen paint swatches across the dining room table, the same table where my grandmother had taught me to roll out pie crusts. "I'm thinking of a soft dove gray for the main living areas of their house," she announced to no one in particular. "It's sophisticated. It will provide a wonderful neutral backdrop for the art we plan to acquire." The use of "we" was telling. My father, meanwhile, was on the phone constantly with his broker, his voice low and urgent. "We're talking about a significant injection of capital," I heard him say from his study. "I want a strategy ready to go the moment the funds are liquid." They treated me like a piece of furniture, discussing their grand plans in front of me as if I weren't there, or perhaps as if my compliance was such a foregone conclusion that my presence was irrelevant. They never once asked me what I thought, what I wanted, or how I was coping with the loss of the only two people who had ever truly loved me. My grief was an inconvenience, a tedious bit of emotional weather they had to wait out before the real business could begin. The day before the reading, my mother took me shopping. It was a strategic move, an attempt to placate the child before the transaction. She bought me a ridiculously expensive dress, a somber navy blue silk that she said was appropriate for a young woman of new means. As I stood in the fitting room, staring at my reflection, she adjusted the collar and smiled at my image in the mirror. "You see, darling, we will take such good care of you. You'll have everything you've ever wanted." But looking at her reflection, at the hard, avaricious gleam in her eyes, I realized I already had everything I'd ever wanted from them. Nothing. I was simply the key to the vault, and they were doing a perfunctory job of polishing me before sliding me into the lock. Their arrogance was my armor, their blindness was my shield. They had no idea I was about to change the locks. We were back in Mr. Davies' office, the scent of old books and leather polish hanging in the air. The room felt like a time capsule, a bastion of my grandfather's world of quiet dignity and unshakable integrity. My parents sat ramrod straight in their chairs, a portrait of feigned patience. My father tapped his expensive watch. My mother subtly reapplied her lipstick. Mr. Davies put on his reading glasses and cleared his throat. "We are gathered to execute the last will and testament of Arthur and Helen Blackwood," he began, his voice steady. He read through the initial bequests, donations to their favorite charities, small sentimental items to old friends. My parents shifted impatiently. Then he arrived at the main clause. "All the remainder of our estate," he read, his eyes lifting to meet mine, "including all properties, stocks, bonds, and liquid assets, we bequeath in its entirety to our beloved granddaughter, Amelia Vance." My mother let out a small, controlled sigh of relief. My father gave me a sharp, satisfied nod. It was done. The first part of their plan was complete. The total value of the estate, after all debts and initial bequests are settled, is estimated to be $26,400,000. My father's eyebrows shot up. Even he was surprised by the number. He was already calculating. I could see it in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, no doubt to initiate the transfer he felt was his due, but Mr. Davies held up a hand. "There is one more section," he said calmly. "It concerns the administration of the estate." My father leaned back, annoyed by the delay. "It is to be placed in a trust, the Amelia Blackwood Vance Trust, to be managed by myself until Amelia reaches the age of 35, or until certain conditions are met." My father leaned forward again, his bonhomie evaporating. "What conditions?" Mr. Davies continued reading, his voice unwavering. "This trust is designed not merely to provide for our granddaughter, but to ensure she is surrounded by genuine love and support, not by avarice. Therefore, access to the capital of this trust by any family member, including her parents, is conditional." He paused, looking directly at my father and mother. "It is conditional upon their ability to demonstrate a fundamental and sincere knowledge of Amelia as a person." The air in the room went still. My father stared, unblinking. My mother's perfectly painted smile froze on her face. This was not in their plan. This was a complication they had not foreseen. And I, for the first time, felt the true, brilliant, posthumous genius of my grandparents' love. Mr. Davies folded the will and placed it gently on his desk. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My father found his voice first, a low, dangerous rumble. What precisely does that mean? A fundamental and sincere knowledge? Mr. Davies opened a second, thinner folder. Arthur and Helen were very specific, he said, his gaze not leaving my parents' faces. They outlined a series of simple questions. Personal details about Amelia. To quote your father, Eleanor. Trivialities that are only known by those who pay attention, and attention is the most basic currency of love. My mother's face was a blank mask of disbelief. Questions. What kind of questions? Mr. Davies read from the new document. For example, what was Amelia's favorite book as a child? What was the name of the stray dog she rescued in the 8th grade and cared for until he passed? On her 10th birthday, when you failed to come home, what gift did we, her grandparents, give her to make up for it? Each question was a tiny, perfectly aimed arrow, striking at the heart of their long and storied neglect. They were questions they could not possibly answer, not because they were difficult, but because they would have required them to be present, to be engaged, to care. My father scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound. This is ridiculous. It's a game. My father-in-law was getting senile. I can assure you, Richard, Arthur was sharper at 90 than most men are at 50, Mr. Davies said coolly. The trust is ironclad. There is a further clause. Should you fail to answer these questions, or should Amelia herself deem the attempts at reconciliation to be insincere and motivated by financial gain, she is granted the right to dissolve the conditional clause and take full, unrestricted control of the entire trust. In short, he said, letting the words hang in the air, the final decision rests with Amelia. All eyes turned to me. My parents stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as their daughter, but as a gatekeeper, an obstacle. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was palpable. For my entire life, they had held all the cards. Now, my grandparents had dealt me a royal flush. I watched the dawning horror on their faces as they began to understand the trap that had been set for them. A trap built not of legal loopholes, but of their own parental failings. My father was the first to explode. He shot to his feet, his face turning a deep, mottled red. "This is an insult!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. "A manipulative, posthumous game. He's trying to humiliate us from the grave." Mr. Davies remained perfectly calm, his hands steepled on his desk. Arthur's intention, as stated in the trust's preamble, was to provide you with an opportunity to build the relationship with your daughter that he felt you had neglected. Relationship? My mother cried, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. The mask of composure had shattered, revealing the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. "We are her parents. We gave her everything. A beautiful home, the best schools, clothes, lessons. How dare he imply we were neglectful?" She turned on me, her eyes blazing with a furious, wounded pride. "Amelia, this is absurd. You know how much we love you. Tell him. Tell him this is a ridiculous charade and that you want us to manage your affairs as we discussed." She wasn't asking me, she was commanding me. She was trying to reassert the old dynamic, to push me back into the small, compliant box she had built for me. But the box was gone. My grandparents had burned it to the ground. I looked at her, at this woman whose approval I had craved for so long, and I felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. "I think," I said, my voice quiet but clear, "that we should respect Grandpa's wishes." The shock on their faces was absolute. It was as if the furniture had started to speak. I had never contradicted them so directly in my life. "You're taking his side?" my father bellowed, pointing a trembling finger at Mr. Davies. "Against your own family?" "Grandpa and Grandma were my family too," I replied, the words tasting of a truth I had held silently for decades. In many ways, they were my only family. That broke them. My mother let out a strangled sob, a sound of pure, theatrical betrayal. "After all we've done for you," she wept, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. "The sacrifices we've made, to be repaid with such ingratitude. You are a cruel, selfish girl, Amelia." My father paced the room like a caged animal. He threatened to contest the will, to drag the family name through the mud, to prove my grandfather was mentally incompetent. He threatened, he blustered, he raged. And through it all, Mr. Davies and I sat in silence, letting him burn himself out. We were witnessing the death throes of their control. They had ruled my world through a combination of emotional blackmail and dismissive authority, and in the space of 10 minutes, my grandparents had dismantled their entire arsenal. They had no power here. Their anger was useless. Their tears were meaningless. Their only path to the money was through me, and they had just shown their hand so completely, so utterly, that they had already lost the game before it had even begun. Before we continue, I need to pause the story for a moment. Please write in the comments section which country you are watching this video from. We have an incredible global family tuning in, and it means the world to us to see where you are all from. And if you're enjoying this story and this is your first time on our channel, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these tales of epic revenge and empowerment. It helps our channel grow and ensures you won't miss what happens next. Okay, thank you for that. Now, let's get back to the story. I watched my parents unravel in that lawyer's office, and a strange cold calm settled over me. They were children throwing a tantrum because their favorite toy had been taken away. The toy, in this case, was my future. For the first time, I saw them not as the towering, omnipotent figures of my childhood, but as they truly were. Small, grasping, and profoundly weak. The drive home was a silent war. They sat in the front of the car, radiating fury, while I sat in the back, a passenger in my own life as always, but this time it was different. I was no longer a prisoner, I was an observer, gathering data. That night, I went into my old room, the room that had always felt more like a guest suite than a place of my own. I pulled out a box from under the bed, a box filled with old journals and scrapbooks, the relics of a lonely childhood. I spent hours poring over them, not with sadness, but with a new sense of purpose. Here was the proof. A journal entry from my 10th birthday detailing how I waited all day for them to come home from a business trip, only to have my grandfather show up at 10 p.m. with a telescope and a promise to show me the stars. Report cards with my grandparents' signatures in the parent-guardian slot. A photograph of me at my high school graduation, flanked by a beaming Arthur and Helen, with my own parents nowhere in sight because they'd had to fly to Aspen for a last-minute conference. It was all there, a meticulously documented history of their absence. My grandparents hadn't just left me a fortune, they had left me an assignment. They had given me the final tool I needed to break free. The trust wasn't about the money, it was about the truth. It was a mechanism designed to force a confrontation that I had spent my entire life avoiding. They knew I would never have the strength to do it on my own, so they built a failsafe into their final gift. They were teaching me one last lesson, that my own validation was worth more than any inheritance. And I would not let them down. The next morning, I woke up a different person. The fog of grief and uncertainty had lifted, replaced by a crystalline clarity. I knew what I had to do. I was no longer the quiet, sensitive girl. I was Arthur and Helen's granddaughter, and my parents were about to find out exactly what that meant. A week later, my parents, having clearly regrouped and strategized, initiated their first offensive. The frontal assault of anger had failed, so now came the campaign of charm. My mother called, her voice once again smooth and sweet, all traces of the previous week's shrewish rage gone. "Amelia, darling," she began, "your father and I have been talking. We were overwrought last week. The grief, you understand. We didn't express ourselves well. We want to make it right. Let us take you to dinner tonight, just the three of us. We need to reconnect." I knew exactly what it was, a reconnaissance mission. They were going to probe for weaknesses, search for the answers to the trust's questions. But I agreed. "I'd like that, Mom," I said, my voice soft and accommodating. I had to let them think their new strategy was working. They chose a restaurant that was ridiculously expensive, a place designed to impress and intimidate. They were on their home turf. Throughout the dinner, they were the perfect parents. They asked about my work, my apartment, my friends, all subjects they had previously shown zero interest in, but their questions were clumsy, transparent. So, tell us again about that little book you used to carry around everywhere as a child, my mother said, sipping her Chardonnay. It was green, wasn't it? With a rabbit on the cover? She was fishing, throwing out a wide net, hoping to catch a fact. It was blue, Mom. And it was about a bear, I replied, offering nothing more. My father tried a different tack. You know, I was just thinking about that mutt you brought home in high school, scruffy little thing. What was his name again? Max? Milo? It was Barnaby, I said, taking a slow sip of water. I watched the information register in their eyes. They were logging it, memorizing it. Barnaby. Blue book about a bear. They thought they were gathering intelligence. They had no idea I was running a counterinsurgency operation. I played the part of the slightly wounded but willing to reconcile daughter perfectly. I let them see a glimmer of the old Amelia, the one who just wanted her parents' approval. I gave them just enough rope, letting them believe they were pulling me closer, when in reality, I was letting them hang themselves with it. I let them pay the exorbitant bill, let them kiss my cheek goodnight with their false affection. I went home to my quiet apartment and wrote down every question they had asked, every detail they had tried to pry from me. The evidence file was growing. They thought they were playing a game of Trivial Pursuit. They didn't understand that I was playing chess. My next step was to fortify my position. I spent the following week conducting my own, much more subtle investigation. I started with old family photo albums. The story they told was stark. In the early years, my parents were in every photo with me, smiling for the camera. But as I got older, they began to disappear, replaced by my grandparents. There was a clear visual timeline of their fading presence in my life. I scanned dozens of these photos, creating a digital folder titled The Vanishing Parents. Then, I moved on to more concrete evidence. I called my godmother, Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, under the guise of wanting to put together a memory book for my grandparents. Carol, unlike my mother, was warm and genuine, though she'd always kept a respectful distance, unwilling to interfere. "Oh, Amelia, that's a wonderful idea," she said, her voice full of warmth. "Your grandparents adored you. You were the light of their lives." I steered the conversation gently. "I'm trying to find some photos from my school events, like the science fair in 5th grade or my piano recitals. Mom and Dad never seemed to have a camera with them." There was a brief, telling pause on the other end of the line. "Well, honey," she said carefully, "your parents were always very busy with their careers. It was wonderful that Arthur and Helen could step in and be there for all of those things. I have a whole box of photos from your recitals. Helen sent them to me every year. She was so proud." She had just confirmed, without me even having to ask, that my parents were consistently absent and that my grandmother knew it. I spent hours on the phone that week, talking to old neighbors, my parents' former friends, even my old piano teacher. The stories were all the same, a chorus of polite variations on a single theme. Your grandparents were always there for you. No one ever said a negative word about my parents, but their absence was the ghost in every conversation. I documented it all. Dates, times, events, and quotes. I was no longer just relying on the wounded memories of a lonely child. I was building a case, brick by factual brick. The most damning evidence came from an old box of my father's files in the attic, files I was ostensibly sorting for donation. I found my complete academic records, from kindergarten to high school. On every single parent-teacher conference slip, every permission form, every medical release, the signature was either Helen's or Arthur's. In 12 years of schooling, my own parents had not signed a single official document for me. They had outsourced my entire childhood. I laid the documents out on my floor, a paper trail of their indifference. And I knew that when the time came, this silent, undeniable proof would be far more powerful than any angry accusation I could ever make. My mother, sensing that the charm offensive was yielding only surface-level results, switched to a new tactic: emotional warfare. She invited me for lunch, just the two of us, at a quiet cafe. This time, there was no pretense of cheerful reconnection. Her expression was somber, her eyes shadowed with a carefully applied melancholy. She began by telling me about her own childhood, painting a picture of a cold, demanding mother, my grandmother, Helen, and a distant, work-obsessed father. It was a story I had never heard before, a narrative of her own emotional neglect. "I never learned how to be a mother, Amelia." she said, a single, perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek. I didn't have a model for it. I was just doing the best I could with what I knew. If I seemed distant, it's because I was afraid. Afraid of doing it wrong. Afraid of failing you. It was a brilliant performance. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of the old sympathy. The lifelong urge to soothe her, to make her feel better. I saw the scared little girl she was describing, and my heart went out to her. Was it possible that I had misjudged her? That her coldness wasn't malice, but simply a damaged person passing on her own trauma? I almost fell for it. But then I looked closer. I saw the way she was watching me, gauging my reaction. This wasn't a confession, it was a strategy. This was her attempt to excuse a lifetime of neglect with a conveniently timed sob story. My grandmother Helen had been nothing but warmth and love to me. This portrait of a cold, unfeeling matriarch didn't align with a single memory I had. It was a lie, a weaponized narrative designed to manipulate me into feeling guilty. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, reaching across the table to take my hand. "All I've ever wanted was for you to be happy, and for our family to be whole." The word family was the trigger. A whole family wouldn't need to ask the name of their own child's dog. A whole family wouldn't have to fish for clues about their daughter's favorite book. I gently pulled my hand away. "Thank you for telling me that, Mom," I said, my voice neutral. "I appreciate your honesty." I gave her nothing. No absolution, no emotional reaction she could use. I paid for lunch and left, leaving her sitting there with her manufactured pain. The experience was clarifying. They wouldn't stop. They would use any tool at their disposal, anger, charm, pity, to get what they wanted. They saw my emotions as just another lock to be picked. And with that realization, the last vestiges of my childhood hope, the faint, lingering wish that they might actually love me, finally died, and I was grateful for it. Hope had been my weakness. Now, I had none. Their desperation grew. A week after my mother's failed attempt at emotional manipulation, my father tried a more direct, business-like approach. He called and requested a meeting, not at a restaurant, but at his office. He had his own lawyer with him this time, a shark-eyed man named Henderson, who looked at me like I was a hostile witness. "Amelia," my father began, "all business. We understand the theatrical nature of your grandfather's will. However, we are a family, and we need to find a practical solution." Henderson slid a sheaf of papers across the polished mahogany table. "What we are proposing is simple," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "You will instruct the trust to provide your parents with a long-term, interest-free loan against your inheritance. It gives them the liquidity they need to manage their assets, and it allows you to fulfill your familial duty without violating the more eccentric clauses of the trust." It was an attempt to bypass the entire system, to find a legal loophole that would render my grandparents' wishes moot. They were trying to bully me, using the weight of their corporate world to make me feel small and ignorant. The old Amelia would have been terrified, intimidated by the lawyers and the legal documents. But the new Amelia had done her homework. I had spent the previous evening on the phone with Mr. Davies, who had anticipated this exact move. "There's no need for that," I said calmly, pushing the papers back across the table. "Grandpa's trust already includes a provision for family support." Hope flickered in my father's eyes. "It does?" "Yes," I said. "It allows me to gift any family member up to $10,000 a year for demonstrated need, provided it does not compromise the long-term health of the trust." $10,000? The amount was a calculated insult. It was less than they spent on wine in a month. My father's face hardened. "That's a pittance. We are talking about millions." "I'm aware," I said, "but that is the provision my grandfather made." Henderson leaned forward. "Miss Vance, perhaps you don't understand the complexities here. A legal challenge could tie up this estate in court for years. It would be unpleasant for everyone." It was a threat, plain and simple. They were threatening to turn my grandparents' legacy into a public spectacle, to drag me through a legal battle they knew I had always been terrified of. "That would be your right, of course," I said, looking not at the lawyer but directly at my father. "But I have to wonder what the press would make of the story. Wealthy parents sue their neglected daughter for the inheritance her loving grandparents left to protect her from them. I'm not sure that's a headline that would be good for your company's stock price. Dad. The color drained from his face. I had taken his greatest weapon, his reputation, his public image, and turned it against him. He was a man who lived in mortal fear of looking weak or foolish. And I had just shown him exactly how I could make him look both. He was utterly speechless. I stood up. "Thank you for the meeting," I said, my voice even. "But I will be honoring my grandfather's wishes to the letter. There will be no loans." I walked out of that office feeling taller than I ever had in my life. The battle wasn't over, but I had just won a major victory. I had faced their power head-on and discovered that it was nothing but a fragile illusion. After 2 months of their failed strategies, I decided it was time to end it. The constant skirmishes were exhausting, and I knew they would never stop. They would continue to probe and push, to charm and threaten, until they either broke me or found a way around the trust. My grandparents had wanted me to be free, and this state of constant siege was not freedom. I called Mr. Davies. "I'm ready," I told him. "I want to call a final meeting. I want to dissolve the conditional clause." "Are you certain, Amelia?" he asked gently. "Once you do this, there's no going back." "I'm certain," I said. "They have shown me who they are. I believe them." I then called my parents and informed them that I had made a decision regarding the trust and wished to discuss it with them in Mr. Davies' office. A wave of triumphant relief washed through the phone line. They thought I was finally capitulating. They believed their campaign of pressure had worked. "Of course, darling," my mother said, her voice bright with victory. "We'll be there. We knew you'd eventually see reason." They arrived at the meeting looking like victors. My father was confident and magnanimous. My mother was gracious and warm. They were already mentally redecorating the Aspen condo they'd always wanted. They greeted me with affectionate smiles, treating me like a beloved, if slightly wayward, child who had finally come home. They sat across from me at the large conference table, their expressions expectant. They were waiting for my surrender. They were waiting for me to say, "You were right. The money is yours. Just tell me what to sign." They believed they had won. Their fatal flaw, the one my grandparents had counted on, was that they had never, not for 1 second, considered the possibility that I had a strategy of my own. They still saw the little girl they had left on the school steps, the quiet teenager they had ignored, the young woman they had condescended to. They were about to be formally introduced to the person I had become. The silence in the room was heavy with their anticipation. Mr. Davies looked at me and gave a subtle, encouraging nod. The stage was set. It was time for the final act. I took a deep breath and looked directly at my parents. Their faces were alight with greedy anticipation. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice calm and steady. "I have reviewed the conditions of the trust, and I've given our situation a great deal of thought." My father leaned forward, a benevolent smile on his face. "We're a family, Amelia. We knew we could work this out." I ignored him. "The trust requires you to demonstrate a fundamental knowledge of me as a person. It asks questions that a loving parent would know the answer to." My mother nodded eagerly. "It was a silly game, but we're ready." "Ask away, darling. The blue book about the bear, the dog named Barnaby. We've been studying." The word studying hung in the air, a perfect, unintentional confession of their entire approach. You don't study someone you love, you just know them. "Actually," I said, "I'm not going to ask you those questions." Confusion flickered across their faces. "I'm not going to," I continued, "because you've already answered the only question that matters." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick, bound folder. I slid it across the table. On the cover, in simple block letters, were the words, "A History of Neglect." "What is this?" my father asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "That," I said, "is my answer. It's a timeline of your involvement in my life. It contains school records you never signed, photos from recitals and graduations you never attended, statements from neighbors and family friends who consistently saw my grandparents stepping into the parental role you abdicated." I watched their faces as the reality of what I was saying began to dawn on them. The confidence drained away, replaced by a dawning horror. "The trust wasn't a quiz for you to pass so you could win a prize," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word. "It was a tool for me. It was my grandparents' final gift, designed to see if you were capable of genuine remorse and change. It was a test to see if you would try to finally know me or if you would just try to find the answers to the test. You chose the latter. I leaned forward. You didn't try to know me. You tried to mine me for data. You saw this not as an opportunity to fix our broken family, but as a business problem to be solved. You used anger, charm, pity, and legal threats to get what you wanted. At no point in the last 2 months did either of you simply ask, "Amelia, how are you feeling about losing the only two people who ever really took care of you?" The truth of the statement landed with the force of a physical blow. They had no response. There was none. "You have failed the test," I said quietly, "not my grandparents' test. You have failed as parents, and I will not spend the rest of my life or a single dollar of their legacy trying to buy the love you were never willing to give for free." The finality of my words hung in the air, absolute and irrevocable. My parents stared at the folder on the table as if it were a bomb. In a way, it was. It was the explosive device that had just obliterated the last vestiges of their power over me. My mother was the first to break, her face crumpling, not in sorrow, but in the frustrated rage of a thwarted child. "You ungrateful," she began, but her voice broke. There were no more tears, no more performances. There was only the raw, ugly truth of her defeat. My father simply sat there, his face ashen. The shrewd businessman, the master of the deal, had been completely outmaneuvered by the daughter he had always dismissed as soft and insignificant. He had been so focused on the rules of the game that he had never bothered to understand its purpose. I turned to Mr. Davies. "As per the final clause of the trust," I said, my voice ringing with an authority I never knew I possessed, "I am formally declaring my parents' attempts at reconciliation to be insincere and motivated by financial gain. I am exercising my right to dissolve the conditional clause and take full, unrestricted control of the Amelia Blackwood Vance Trust, effective immediately." Mr. Davies nodded solemnly. "I will file the necessary paperwork this afternoon, Amelia. Your grandparents would be very proud." My parents finally stood up, their movements stiff and jerky. They were strangers in a world that no longer bent to their will. They didn't look at me as they walked out of the office. They couldn't. To look at me would be to acknowledge the magnitude of their failure, not just to secure the fortune they coveted, but to love their own child. As the door clicked shut behind them, a profound sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't the triumphant thrill of victory, but the quiet, steady calm of liberation. The war was over. I had won, but more importantly, I was finally free. A few days later, I met with Mr. Davies again. I instructed him to help me set up a charitable foundation in my grandparents' names. The Blackwood Foundation would provide grants and support to community programs for neglected and at-risk children. It was the perfect way to honor their legacy by turning the money they had used to save me into a resource to save others. I was wielding the tool they had given me, not to break things, but to build. I sold my parents' house and all its cold, perfect furniture. I sold the expensive, somber dress my mother had bought me. I kept nothing that reminded me of the life I had left behind. 1 year later, I stood on the wraparound porch of my grandparents' house, which was now my house. I hadn't changed a thing. The garden was still a chaotic bloom, the furniture was still worn and comfortable, and the air still smelled of peppermint and old books. It was a home, not a showcase. My life was unrecognizable from what it had been. I was the full-time director of the Blackwood Foundation, a job that gave me a sense of purpose I had never imagined possible. We had already funded a new wing for a local youth center and established a scholarship program for kids from broken homes. I had learned to be a leader, to be decisive, to be strong, not because someone told me to toughen up, but because I had found a reason to be. I traveled, not to the glamorous resorts my parents favored, but to places I had only read about in books. I saw the pyramids in Egypt and walked the Great Wall of China. I went alone, but I was never lonely. I was too busy living, too busy breathing in the freedom I had fought so hard to win. My parents and I had not spoken since that day in the lawyer's office. I heard through Aunt Carol that they had sold their large house and downsized. My father's reputation had taken a quiet but significant hit after the story of the will inevitably leaked into their social circles. They had lost not just the money, but the one thing they truly valued: status. About 6 months ago, I received a letter with my mother's handwriting on it. It was short, just 3 sentences. I am sorry, not for the money, but for everything. I hope one day you find happiness. There was no manipulation in it, no hidden agenda. It was the first honest thing she had ever said to me. I didn't reply, but I kept the letter. It was a reminder that sometimes, even in the most barren soil, something like remorse could begin to grow. I never set out for revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. What I had achieved was something cleaner, more permanent. It was justice. My grandparents had given me the ultimate inheritance, the chance to become myself. The $26 million was just a tool. The real wealth was the strength they had instilled in me, the quiet confidence that I was worthy of love and respect, not because of my name or my bank account, but simply because of who I was. Standing on that porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt them with me. Their love was in the rustle of the leaves, the solid wood beneath my feet, the peaceful silence of a life finally lived on my own terms. They had given me my freedom, and I would spend the rest of my days living a life that was worthy of that incredible gift.